Here to hear from Justin Mckinney, who is a baseball researcher and archivist living in Canada, who's written articles on 19th and early 20th century baseball. He has finished a book on baseball's union association, which there's obviously been some controversy in recent years about, as we discuss, what is a major league and what is not a major league. Union association is often mentioned along with Federal League and a couple of others as maybe not being major league. Justin is going to address that controversy, as well as tell us about some little known entries in that league, such as the Altoona franchise, which I believe played 15 games before it disbanded, something like that. And yeah, and so
25 games, but yeah,
25,
it's the same difference.
And so we'll be hearing more about that. And so for those of you who are hearing this recording, welcome as well. But for those of us who are here in person, we'll have the opportunity to ask Justin some questions at the end. So, Justin, thank you very much for doing this. Thank you for your patience, and take it away.
Yeah, my pleasure. I just have a PowerPoint slide show, so I'll get that set up. Maybe if I can, I'll share the screen, and then I think if someone can show, like OJ can give me access to share the screen, that would be helpful.
Oh. There you are. You're now co-host.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so this particular presentation was going to focus primarily on the Altoona unions, just because I thought I'm trying to make everything a little bit more regionally flavored for the specific SABR chapters I've been talking to. But I'm happy to answer any and all questions about the Union Association, including its recognition and viability as a major league, et cetera, et cetera. So feel free to ask any questions at the conclusion of this. So yeah, we'll get started. So we have the famous Altoona versus the Union Association. So essentially the journey sort of starts in 1883 with the Western Interstate League, where Altoona was probably the best club in the circuit. They compiled a 51-22-1 record in all of the contests on the season, which included numerous exhibition games. And they even managed to beat the Pittsburgh Alleghenies of the American Association in one contest. Yeah, like they were hosted a bunch of exhibition games. It was very common practice at that time and a great source of income for teams that could host visitors on off days, etc. And Altoona was essentially a really good railroad hub because it connected the east to west railroad, and teams going from east to west would stop in Altoona very frequently, and that's why they'd often be playing exhibition games there. I believe the Philadelphia Athletics, their manager said one of their highest grossing games on the season took place in Altoona in 1883. So it was a good market for that sort of thing. And then towards the end of the season, there was one report that they had made an application to the American Association, which I don't know how accurate that is, but it shows sort of what they might have been thinking, of what the directors of the club might have been thinking. And that's a photo of the 1883 Altoona club. There's no photo of the Union Association club, but there's quite a few players who appeared for the 1884 Altoonas in this photo, including Charlie Manlove and George Daisy and a couple others. So in early 1884, Ed Curtis, he was elected president of the newly formed Interstate Association, which would compile teams in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And he was also the director of, or the business manager of the Altoona Club. And then sort of in January, February, they go into the business of signing players for this club in this minor league association, and it's a mix of players from the 1883 squad, as well as semi-pros from the region. And there's only one major league on the roster. It's a guy by the name of Jack Larry. I'll talk a bit about him later. And then by February 1884, the Interstate Association has kind of collapsed. And so Altoona is now a team without a league. And that brings us to the Union Association, which was kind of formed as a concept in 1883 in September. There were plans for this 8-team circuit that would ignore the reserve rule in baseball. So by 1883, each team in the National League, the American Association, and the minor Northwestern League could reserve up to 10 players off of the roster for the coming season. And so this was sort of the early days of the reserve rule, which eventually became the reserve clause and all that sort of thing. But the Union Association has followed with this idea that they're not going to respect the reserve rule. They won't sign players under contract, but they will sign players who've been reserved but have not signed a contract. And so St. Louis millionaire Henry Lucas, he becomes the league's president and the guiding force and financier, and he ends up running the St. Louis club, which turns out to be the best club in the circuit. And by the end of 1883, they only have 6 franchises in place. So there's Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Washington. But they're looking to have 8 teams because for scheduling purposes, it's just way easier to do an 8-team league than a 6-team league. And then they also want to preserve an east-west balance. So that means they're looking for one team in the east and then one team in the west. And so essentially, in response to the Union Association forming, the American Association had expanded by 4 teams in response. And then they also, because both the American Association actually had put teams in New York in 1883, this kind of locked out. And then also Brooklyn joined the American Association. It sort of shut the Union Association of New York, which was the biggest market in the country, still is. And then virtually every viable market was home to a major league team. And the Northwestern League also expanded from 8 teams to 12 teams as well in response. And so just there was not a lot of places that could be home to a ball club. And then by early 1884, there were a few viable markets left. The Union Association was negotiating with a Boston group that was headed by George Wright. And then they still had an 8th spot that they were looking to. And that's where Altoona comes in. So in late February, Henry Lucas reaches out to the directors of the club about joining the Union Association. And then on February 20th, they officially are accepted into the league. They become the league's 4th Western locale. And then Boston also joins officially on March 17th, but the season's supposed to open on April 17th. So that gives them a month to form a roster and get their ballpark finished. And so it's quite an ordeal. So essentially that's sort of the offseason heading to 1884. And then we can ask the question, why was Altoona considered for this, prestigious position? They essentially were a very small market. They just under 20,000 people on the 1880 census, which placed them just outside the 100 largest urban areas in the United States. And so, they were not a big market by any stretch. The club had performed well in 1883. They were one of the best clubs at that level, and they made money on the season. And fans from nearby Tyrone and Harrisburg would travel to games. So the idea was that this larger region would have enough people to support games. Location was very convenient. The teams traveled east to west and west to east, and they hosted numerous exhibition games. And this would help scheduling for the Union Association because you have 4 teams on the east, 4 teams in the west. The way it worked, because of train travel, oftentimes teams would take these extended road trips of like 6 weeks, where they would go all the way to to the west or go to the east and hit all the markets there and then come back. And so having cities located in some proximity to one another was very important to make sure these trips were sort of manageable, given just the limitations of train travel. And then there's a sense of desperation, like Lucas and company, they needed another team, and Altoona needed a league to play in. And so it's, the only way they could make money in 1884 was to play in a baseball league. And so there was this opportunity, and Lucas was looking to get the season started with 8 teams intact. But there were a few red flags. Would the Union Association even take the field, right? Because at this point it's a concept, but there's a lot of debate about the legitimacy of it, as well as whether there's the actual money to get the league up and running. And then this question, could Altoona compete in this new league? Because they had formed to compete in the Interstate Association, which was going to be a minor league, and a lower level minor league at that. So would they be any good? The size of the city is an issue. It was an issue in the National Association when they put teams in places like Keokuk and Middletown, Connecticut, but it's also an issue here with Altoona. The other big issue is that the Union Association, by forming as this rebel league outside of the recently signed national agreement, which sort of codified a lot of the ways in which teams would look up, leagues would respect each other's boundaries, they were outside of that entirely. So basically every single team in professional baseball was going to be in opposition to the Union Association, and that meant there was no opportunity to play exhibition games against any visitors or anything like that. And so that's a huge loss of revenue, because if they're doing a 112 game season and a 56 game schedule, those off days kind of add up, and losing out on that money is like a big potential issue. So they really need to depend on having good attendance at home through the Union Association games. Otherwise they're at risk. And then money, we don't know how much money the Altoona directors and owners are willing to put forth. And then there's also the question, could Henry Lucas be counted on? Because again, he's a polarizing figure at this time. He has money. He's a legitimate millionaire in $1884, and he's only 26 years old. But you also wonder, like, will he change his mind? Like, what? You're putting a lot of faith in this guy who you don't really know, and so that's a big issue. So we'll talk about a couple of the key directors in the club. So there's William W. Gritz. He was born in 1849. He was a pharmacist in Hollidaysburg and later relocated to Pittsburgh. He was a baseball lover, and he managed the semi-pro Juanita team out of Hollidaysburg. His son, Jimmy Gritz, played for that club and also played a bit in the minors. They even made one appearance for the Pittsburgh Pirates in 1894. And he would serve as the director, so kind of the key financier and kind of money man for the club. And he died in 1904. And then there's Ed Curtis. Apologies for the poor photo. That's the best thing I could find of him. I think it's on Baseball Reference. He's currently credited as the club's manager. He was born in 1843 in Hartford. He worked in the insurance industry and as a bookseller. He had been elected president of the Interstate Association in January, and he was the business manager. And then, when the league just fell apart, he joined the Union Association, and he acted as manager of the club. To my knowledge, that's his only known baseball experience. We don't know that he was involved in any other baseball clubs in other cities or anything like that. That's all I've been able to come across his involvement with Altoona. He died in 1914 in Bath, New York. So we'll get into a bit of the finances of what it looked like heading into the season. Altoona had spent nearly $2,000 to improve the ballpark, which doesn't sound like a lot, but given the standards of the time, it's pretty decent. And they had the financial support of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. The financial condition of the association has been healthy, contributed largely by able management, was one of the descriptions for the season of the 1883. Washington Nationals manager Mike Scanlon of the Union Association, he claimed that the Altoona owners were ready to lose up to $20,000 on the season if that's what it meant to finish the season. We don't know any of the actual salaries for the 1884 season, but in 1883, the club paid out a quite modest $600 per month in salaries. The battery of Jim Brown and Charlie Manlove were the highest paid players at $90 per month. To put that in context, the rough average salary in the Union Association is players getting paid about $200 per month. So that's like less than half. So assuming they signed similar contracts in 1840, that would put the club as one of the lowest paid clubs in the league, possibly the lowest salaried club. But they entered the season in good financial shape and with the lowest salaries in the league. So there's reason for optimism. The general rule of thumb is that to cover costs, a team in 1884 in the Union Association needed to average about 1,300 fans per game. And we'll see if that comes true. So Altoona officially takes the field on April 17th, 1884. Only 500 fans are in attendance. This game is opening in Cincinnati, which is expected to be one of the best teams in the league. They're expected to rival St. Louis for the league's pennant. And they're also going head-to-head with the Cincinnati Red Stockings of the American Association. John Murphy is Altoona's starting pitcher. He faces George Bradley for Cincinnati. George Bradley, of course, is one of the finest pitchers of the 1870s, had that amazing 1876 season. But by 1884, he's a bit of a broken down pitcher, but he had a resurgence in 1883, winning 20 games for the Philadelphia Athletics and helping them win the pennant. And he comes to Cincinnati sort of just for the money, basically, because they offer him a 2-year contract at a better salary than he can make in the American Association. So he jumps at it because he's kind of an older, broken down player. Charlie Manlove, he's expected to be the Altoona starting catcher. He has a pretty good reputation defensively. He gets injured during pregame warm-ups and is replaced by Jerry Moore. And the game was 2-1 Cincinnati until the 8th inning when Cincinnati scored 5 runs. And then Jerry Moore hits a late home run in the 9th, first club in home run in club history, and results at 7-2 loss. So despite the final score, it had been a fairly competitive game. But yeah, nonetheless, a 7-2 loss, and kind of goes downhill from there. The club is mocked as the famous Altoonas by O.P. Kaler, who's the Cincinnati commercial sports writer. He's probably the Union Association's staunchest critic. Like if you read the Cincinnati commercial sports pages in 1884, he's just blistering in his critique of the league, and it's really funny, but also like pretty stiff. And yeah, so he's a very clever guy, but yeah, he really has a hate for the Union Association. Jack Lilly, who is the only major league player with major league experience on the Altoona roster, he starts game 2, but he's torched for 4 runs in the top of the first, and the club loses 9-2. Jim Brown, he had been the star pitcher for the 1883 club. He starts game 3, and the results in the lost 9-6. So after 3 games, Altoona's 0-3, and they get on the train to St. Louis to face Henry Lucas and his St. Louis Unions. So I figured we'd talk a bit about who the famous Altoonas were. There's a few players on the roster worth discussing. In writing the book, I became kind of obsessed with this guy, Jack Lilly. He began his career in 1876 pitching for London, Ontario club. He was a highly touted pitching prospect, plus a versatile infielder. He eventually appeared for Boston, Detroit, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Louisville from 1880 to 1883. By the end of 1883, he's actually pitching for an independent club in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the Sporting Life, the sort of weekly newspaper, like the nation's best like weekly newspaper at that point for sports. They talk about how he's just completely washed up. Like he can't even get hitters out in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and you know it's sort of like this sad demise. He's one of the players, one of the many of that era who was plagued by alcoholism. From his 1878 to 1887, which is the last year of his career, he was suspended at least once every year for alcoholism, and often more times than that. He was very disappointing for Altoona, which suggests he was quite possibly completely washed up at this point. He only hit he had less than 100, let's just say that, and lost all 3 of his pitching starts. And then he was released in early May, and on his way out of town, he got beat up by some toughs. He ended up going to Terre Haute, Indiana. He washes out there because of his alcoholism, plays for Chicago, has the same thing, and then just bounced around the minors for a few more years. And then, yeah, just a guy I became very fascinated with just by his inability to ever stay in one place for a long period of time, but also just that he was the compelling talent that kept getting chance after chance after chance, but just could never get his personal life sorted out. And I imagine being an alcoholic in the 1880s, which is not an easy task, given how little support there would have been for folks like that. This is probably the best player on the club, George Germany Smith. He had played for the club in 1883. He was a 25-year-old shortstop. He hit a very solid .315 in 25 games. He was signed by Cleveland after Brooklyn folded, and then when Cleveland disbanded in the offseason. He was sold to Brooklyn and became a key player on the pennant-winning Brooklyn clubs in 1889 and 1890. He's undoubtedly the best defensive shortstop of the 19th century. His 22.8 defensive WAR was the record up until the start of the 20th century, and he held the single season record at 3.2 in 1892. And yeah, he was just a wonderful defensive stuff. If you want a sort of more modern analog, like Mark Bellinger for the Baltimore Orioles in the 1970s, probably the most similar kind of comp, where just someone who was exceptional defensively, but not a very good hitter, but had a ton of value regardless, and he got started in Altoona. Jerry Moy was another talented player for the club. He was a Canadian-born catcher. He's probably the best hitter on the club. He had .313, and he had 1 home run and 10 RBIs in 20 games. But his fatal flaw was that he was an awful defensive catcher. Even by the standards of the time, he had an .839 fielding percentage, which is well below the league average. He made 18 errors, 27 pass balls in 12 games for Altoona. And even without gloves, that is still just an exceptionally poor record and undoubtedly contributed to the struggles that Altoona had. And he signed with Cleveland in December 1884, and then he played a bit in Detroit in 1885, and then he spent the rest of his career in the minors. Jim Brown was one of the club's starting pitchers. He had pitched for Altoona in 1883. His starting catcher was injured on opening day, so he had to pitch to guys like Jerry Moore. He went just 1-9 with a 5.35 ERA. And he had real control issues. He walked 36 batters in 74 innings, which doesn't sound like a lot, but then in 1840, you have to remember that it took 7 balls to draw a walk. And Manlove and Brown were signed by New York and made 1 appearance for him after Altoona had folded, and they made 1 appearance in 1886. He's also currently credited with for St. Paul, who joins the Union Association in September and plays about 9 games. But I suspect it's actually a different player, but it's one of those mysteries lost to time. And John Murphy, unfortunately don't have a photo for him. So if anyone knows John Murphy or his family, please get in touch. I'd love to have a photo of this guy. He was probably the best pitcher on the club. He had come from the semi-pro ranks in Philadelphia. He actually went a very respectable 5-6. So he's credited with 5 of the 6 Altoona wins, and a 3.87 ERA in 14 appearances. He was named the captain in mid-May, and he acted as the field manager for the last couple of weeks. And then he was signed by Wilmington of the Eastern League, and Wilmington dominated the Eastern League. And then they also joined the Union Association to replace Philadelphia when they had folded in August. Wilmington was maybe even a worse club than Altoona, and they went just 2-16. And Murphy was a hard luck loser. He went 0-6 despite a respectable 3 ERA. I played a couple of seasons in the Eastern League. So that brings us to the Altoona surviving in St. Louis. There's a photo of Henry Lucas, who is the owner and magnate behind St. Louis and also the Union Association. They were the best team in the league. They had actually signed legitimate major league players, including Fred Dunlap and Orlando Schaefer, as well as Billy Taylor, Jack Gleason, and Buttercup Dickerson. And those 5 can form the nucleus of the team. And by the time Altoona arrived in St. Louis, they were already perceived as kind of Bush League. They were supposed to play a 4-game series, including a Sunday contest on April 27th. And that Sunday contest is kind of crucial. I'll get into the details later on. But they were absolutely destroyed by St. Louis. They lose 11-2, 9-3, and 7-1. 7-1 and 8-1, and so after 7 games, they're 0-7, have been outscored nearly over 3-1, so 60 runs to 17. So it's not looking good for Altoona. But in life, things can always get worse, and so Altoona and St. Louis, they travel to Altoona to play the next series. So St. Louis is going to play Altoona in Altoona, and then on a positive note, Altoona will be home basically through the end of April and through the entire month of May. So they'll have this extended homestand, which hopefully they can build support and maybe improve their play a bit. But they made their home debut in front of 2,000 fans. So it's a pretty solid crowd. I think it's a weekday, which is a very decent crowd for a weekday game. But they are absolutely outclassed and lose 15-2 St. Louis. Game 2, they lose 16-3. Only 600 fans attendance. Altoona releases 5 players, including Jack Lilly, who is roughed up on his way out of town, like I said before. And on May 3rd, they lose game 3, 14-5. There's another good crowd of 2,000 in attendance. And then game 4, 12-2, 1,000 in attendance. So again, the early returns on attendance are fairly decent. Like if they can have between 1,000, 2,000 fans per game, I mean, they should be able to make money off of that. But after 11 games, they're now 0-11 and have outscored 117-29. And that's a woodcut of the opening day roster of the St. Louis Unions, including Fred Dunlap, who ends up hitting, I think, 412 and winning the Triple Crown, and a few other players like Buttercup Dickerson and Billy Taylor, who both are really great. And then Ted Sullivan, who is the club's manager and a very interesting figure in 19th century baseball and had a lot to do with the development of the game in the Western United States. And so here's a photo. I'm not sure the date of it. I expect it's probably 20th century of the club's grounds. It was located as the 4th Avenue grounds, aka Columbia Park, located at Lower 6th Street, 4th Avenue in Mill Run Road, for those of you who are familiar with Altoona's geography, of which I'm unfortunately not. And yeah, they were the park was home to various minor league clubs through 1912. So that brings us to Sunday baseball, which was a big source of controversy. It's still kind of a novelty, and in 1884 is still very much a problem for a lot of folks. The state of Pennsylvania was notoriously conservative on the matter. In fact, Sunday baseball wasn't legal until 1933 in Philadelphia, which seems pretty wild to me. And this puritanism was present in the Altoona fan base. Altoona had agreed not to host Sunday games, but they had planned to play Sunday road contests as the schedule required. And there was some public outcry in Altoona about them having played a Sunday game well in St. Louis. And then there's some belief that this offense alienated local fans and kept them away from the ballpark. And here's a nice woodcut of a happy preacher who is looking forward to punishing anyone who tries to have fun on a Sunday, but feels fitting for the way some people viewed Sunday entertainment back in those days. And here's a fun quote from O.P. Kaler in the Cincinnati commercial. The famous Altoona club has announced that it will not play any more games on Sunday. The next announcement they make will be that they will not play any more games on weekdays. And I think that's a funny line, gives you a taste of what he was like. But it wasn't all bad. There's occasionally positive things can happen. The surprising Boston Unions were the next foes to head to Altoona. There's a photo of Tommy Bond, who was one of the finest pitchers of the 1870s, but basically had his arm destroyed by throwing 3,000 plus innings by the time he was 24. And so he had tried a number of comebacks, but after a couple of years of basically full-on rest, he was signed as the starting pitcher for Boston, and he pitched very well. They were 9-2, thanks in part to his pitching. And on May 10th, nearly 3,000 fans witnessed the debut of Boston in Altoona, and amazingly, there was a victory for Altoona. They took the contest 9-4 over Boston. So that put they gave them their first win. And it just one of those strange things that happens in baseball. Just 2 weeks later, Boston was the team that broke the St. Louis Unions 20-0 start to the season by handing an 8-point defeat in St. Louis, also behind the pitching of Tommy Bond, which I think is just a funny thing that they can go from getting beat by the worst team in baseball to beating one of the better teams in baseball in the span of a couple of weeks. But things get back to normal pretty quickly. They lose 10-3 on May 12th to Boston. Then the lowly Philadelphia Keystones travel to Altoona. They're probably one of the weakest teams in the league as well. They have just a 3-11 record, but they take 3 games out of 4 to Altoona. But 2 of the losses led by 1 run, so it suggests a bit more of a competitive balance between the 2 clubs. But yeah, attendance has now dipped to the 300 and 400 range, so that's not going to be sustainable if it continues. And then as a result of all these kind of controversies about the attendance and about Sunday baseball. W.W. Ritz stepped down as director of the club. And yeah, I'm sure he's embarrassed by the field embarrassed by the situation of how poor the club is performing on the field, and also like the fact that they're not making money. And finally, the Sunday baseball is like, again, like he probably doesn't want to be scrutinized as doing something immoral or dishonest or problematic for the citizens of the town, because he's someone of fairly high stature, as like the pharmacist in Hollywood and that sort of thing. And yeah, so the Ed Curtis makes a few last-ditch efforts to turn the season around. They essentially connect the railroad to the entrance of the ballpark, which is supposed to be enable them to people have easier access to get to the park. And then he attempts to recruit some veteran players and an actual field manager for the club. So Ned Cuthbert and Harry McCaffrey, who are both two veteran players, are offered $250 a month to join the club, but both men turn it down. And then John Murphy is named the team captain, and he manages the field duties for the last couple of weeks. And then something even more surprising happens, and honestly, God, winning streak. The league's other terrible club, the Washington Nationals, are 4-15 when they come to Altoona. They lose 13-3 in game 1, but then they take the next 3 games from the Nationals. So that puts the win streak to 3 games, and then they're 5-16, and they actually move briefly out of 8th place, last place in the league. So they're in 7th place, and then Baltimore Unions, who are another strong club in the league, they go on to finish in 3rd place in the league and well above 500. They lose the opening game of the series to Altoona. Let's go 3-2 in a 13-inning contest that is described as the finest game ever played in Altoona, but only 300 fans are in attendance for that contest. And here's a photo of the Washington Nationals of 1883, which comprises a number of the members who appeared for 1884 club. And this is actually the photo I used for the cover of my book. I think it's a wonderful baseball photo. And there's very few actual photos of Union Association teams. There's only a couple known to exist, and this was a far nicer and highly as a pretty image than anything I could find. So just want to share that with you. But again, despite this 4-game winning streak, things are not looking good. Baltimore rebounds with a 13-0 victory on May 29th. And also Henry Lucas, the league president, comes to Altoona for a visit, presumably to discuss the team's future. May 30th is Decoration Day, which is one of 2 national holidays on the season. So essentially that's a big deal because it means there's anyone can attend because typically everyone has a day off. So along with Independence Day, that's just like going to be the biggest crowds of the season for most clubs. They draw a very strong crowd of 3,000 fans, with a lot of those fans reportedly coming from Hollidaysburg and Tyrone, but they lose 9-0. And then on May 31st, they have another solid crowd of 1,000 in attendance to play Baltimore. 3 of their players, Jerry Moore, Taylor Schaefer, and Charlie Berry, refused to play unless they're paid outstanding back pay. So instead of paying them back, they are fined $50. And then there's a lot of rumors now with Lucas's presence and all this talk about them owing the players money that the club will disband. And so there's one final day in the history of the Altoona franchise on May 31st in front of this crowd of 1,000 strong. They take the field with 3 of the best players of the lineup. Charlie Manlove finally makes his season debut after being injured for the past 6 weeks, and a local player named George Daisy. That's a photo of him there. Again, not the highest quality, but he played for the 1883 club. He's positioned in left field. The game is not a close one. It's 3-3 heading into the 8th inning, but Daisy, making his first and only major league appearance, drops an easy fly ball that leads to 2 Baltimore runs, and the final score ends up 5-3. And it's a sort of fitting end to the Altoona franchise to lose so painfully. And essentially, they announced that the club's going to disband after the game. And so the question is, why did they disband? Well, part of it's a bit of a mutual decision. While in Altoona, Lucas had met with the club directors to look over the finances. Altoona had only about $1,500 in capital left, reportedly, and they were behind in payment to the players, and then also in dues to the Union Association. And so Lucas threatened to remove the club from the league unless $150 in overdue fees were paid to the league. And so Altoona refused to pay up and they withdrew from the league. And so Lucas had been expecting this situation to happen. And he had met with some investors in Kansas City, Missouri, about putting a club there to replace Altoona. And so the aftermath of the disbandment of Altoona, Kansas City joins the league in early June, and they replace Altoona, and they are terrible on the field, but they do really well at the box office. Like they play Sunday games that often draw 8,000 people. And so by the end of the season, Casey's one of the most profitable clubs in the league, and it's the first major league team in Kansas City. It sort of proves that Kansas City is a good baseball market. And yeah, they made $7,000 in profit, which is quite good for the time. After Altoona folded, they reformed as the Altoona Browns, which would be an independent cooperative club with players and the owners sharing expenses, and they would take on all comers, and the idea was that they would then get to host these lucrative exhibition games. But this plan peters out within a couple of weeks because a bunch of the players get real offers to sign with actual professional clubs, and so Jeremy Smith and Jerry Moore end up in Cleveland. John Murphy goes to Wilmington. Charlie Manlove and Jim Brown sign with both New York and Indianapolis, and there's some debate about whose rights they belong to, but New York ends up winning the rights, but they both have a short stint there. So then we can ask the question, what went wrong with Altoona? First off, attendance was pretty disappointing. They averaged between 600 and 900 fans a game. And despite the low payroll, this just simply wasn't enough to cover costs. You generally need about 1,300 fans per game to break even. Every team that was above that threshold were the teams that made money in the league, and anything that was below that, those are the teams that lost money. Essentially, the way the union association was structured, every visiting club would receive a $75 road guarantee for every game. The only games that were split for gate receipts were the 2 holiday games. And so essentially this $75 road guarantee was kind of tricky because it wasn't enough to cover the road expenses. So if you're on the road for 5 or 6 weeks and get paid $75 a game, that's just not enough to cover all you need to do. And then it also penalizes the home clubs that have poor attendance, because imagine you draw 200 fans to a game and then ticket prices were 25 cents a ticket. Essentially, you'd be going into debt to pay out this road guarantee. And so it was just this tricky thing that didn't help the road clubs and also penalized the home clubs. And the fact that Altoona could not play exhibition games really killed the financial stability. They thrived in 1883 doing the same thing, but because they're blocked from playing against other clubs, they lost a ton of money that way. The quality is obviously like the big hallmark of just what went wrong in Altoona. They were just not a good ball club. They'd formed as a minor league club. They did nothing really to make themselves competitive. And the only sustained success came against the worst clubs in the league. And they would scored 216-90 and had a 6-19 record. And so there was no real hope for them to get any better than that. And then the Sunday baseball was like kind of an issue in that they seem to have alienated some locals, caused negative press, and then this may very well have impacted attendance, and also W.W. Goetz's decision to leave the club. And so, that sort of concludes this talk. I have my book, Baseball to Union Association, which includes some good discussions about Altoona, but also every other facet of the league. I've just been told it's now being shipped out. So if you pre-ordered the book, you hopefully will be receiving it in the mail soon. But it's very exciting that it's finally kind of heading out into the universe. But feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm at just_McKinney, and then you can email me as well if you have questions. But that sort of concludes the Union Association discussion on Altoona. But feel free if you have any questions about Altoona or anything else, I'm more than happy to answer. So,
fantastic. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, my pleasure.
There was one question in the chat. Let me see if I can get it here. Andrew Singer seems pretty lucky that 300 in attendance for the first win. And any idea why so many after prior attendance poor? You kind of discussed that, but did you want to speak to what was the reason for the 300 or the 3,000 in attendance for the first win? Was that a weekend game or?
Yeah, I expected it as a weekend game because like Altoona didn't play Sunday games, but they would play Saturday games. So typically Saturday would be like kind of a better day for attendance than a weekday game. So that'd be my guess is why they would have had 3,000 fans in attendance.
Okay, and you spoke a little bit to why they had low attendance. Otherwise, any other comments you have on that?
Yeah, I mean ultimately like they essentially the pattern that typically happened with a lot of these clubs in the Union Association is like St. Louis was the kind of everyone was intrigued by St. Louis because they had this reputation. They got a lot of national press. They had these starting major league players, and so when they come to town, teams would typically draw. They would often draw very well. But then the downside is that you played against St. Louis and you're getting creamed, and so it's like, well, we can't compete, and so that is very demoralizing on the flip side. And then also, when the Philadelphia Keystones come to town and they're 3-11 and like everyone knows they're terrible, like we're not gonna go see them play because like they stink. So no one wants to go see like two terrible teams play against each other, versus like at least the St. Louis is a draw, but then it's kind of like a double-edged sword in that you are competitive against that club and it shows your true colors, but then the bad clubs you also don't want to see. And so I think just very quickly like this, there was a real loss of hope for the local fans because they'd entered the season pretty optimistic. And ATA3, they had a good season in the minors and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it was just like the hope got beat out of them pretty quickly. And then I think there's a lot of town pride as well, because the sense is like if the national papers are making fun of your city or your town or your ball club, like you probably would feel a bit like either defensive or hurt, and you might want to distance yourself from it. So I think that's a bit of that as well.
Certainly. If people want to come off of mute and ask additional questions, you're welcome to do that. I was surprised to learn. I knew that Altoona had been one of the weaker teams in the Union Association, but I was surprised to learn about their 1883 record and that they were one of the best teams that season. So that made a lot more sense to me that Altoona would be sought after, given that.
Yeah, I think it was just like a perfect storm of like where the situation enables it. Like, well, we don't have a league anymore, and there's someone offering us an opportunity to play, and maybe it'll be lucrative, that sort of thing. Yeah, and I think there was a less of a sense of like nowadays we have a very good sense of like team quality and league quality and like, but in 1884 that wasn't really as defined, and so
right.
Like again with the Pittsburgh Alleghenies, who were not a good club in the American Association, and we're also a famously debauched club. If they show up into your town and you beat them, you think, oh, we can hang with the big boys. But you might not realize, oh, the players showed up hungover or whatever, like they're not trying their best. So sometimes they would often like underperform an exhibition game because you want to create hope for like next time they come through, oh, we beat them, or there's a close game, so maybe we can do it this time. It's like there's a bit of like teams would always give their best in exhibition games, so it gives a false impression of like how good you actually are if you beat this traveling team that doesn't really have anything at stake.
They're also never going to in that time. They're not going to start their main pitcher.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's just kind of like but if you're in the crowd that day, you like have a lot of wow, we beat the American Association, whatever, that sort of thing. And so it's so it's great.
I don't have a question per se, but just wanted to just chip in and say that this was really interesting. I am not a student of 19th century baseball, but I think I'm going to go get this book because it was really interesting. So appreciate it. I used to live not that far away from Altoona, so didn't really know of the history there. So this is really interesting to me. I appreciate it.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and
same here. I just finished Edward Acorn's book on Old Hoss Radbourne, 59.
Yeah.
I just finished reading that last week, and so yeah, it's definitely a fascinating year.
Yeah, that book was a big inspiration to me, and like I talk a lot about Radbourne and Charlie Sweetie in this book, because that sort of takes up the summer. Is like this all this drama coming out of Providence and stuff, and Edward Acorn's a wonderful writer. Like he's it's like just so talented, the way he just incorporates the personal, and like just you really feel like you know Radbourne by the end of the book. You just understand him, it's really neat.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating, fantastic.
Yeah, and you go to the next book in the 1883 season as well, which covers the pennant race between St. Louis and Philadelphia and the American Association. And it's another great book as well.
Okay, good to know.
I've had this book for years.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
probably
yeah.
gathered dust
Yeah.
through the years, but I think I'm going to start digging into it a bit.
Yeah, I use that a lot. Like David Nemec's a really great 19th century researcher,
Yeah.
and used his book. There's he did another one called Baseball, like 19th Century Rank and File, which just has all these like mini profiles of basically every player in the 19th century.
Okay.
And I use that a ton for my research for various things, because the Union Association has some of the most obscure players of all time. And so it's just a neat trying to dig up on facts on these kind of oddball players.
Okay, so I got to ask the question, which is, and I remember you talking about this at the Baltimore convention.
Yeah.
Union Association, Major League or con?
It's a bit of both. I mean, I think like from a statistical standpoint, there's no question the Union Association is probably the weakest of any sort of recognized major league, other than I personally recognize the National Association as a major league, but like it's not officially recognized. But like other than the earliest seasons of that, like this is like definitely the weakest congregation. But the reason, the point I make about it being a major league is that basically in 1884 it formed, and the other major leagues tried to stop it. They actively like tried to kill it and put teams in cities to try and force them out. They put a new team in Washington to rival the Washington team in the Union Association. They really thought them as maybe not a threat, but just this is something we need to deal with. And then in 1885, at the first kind of moment, they induced Henry Lucas to jump to the National League, and this with the idea that we'll just kill this stupid association and get rid of it. So from that point, like they saw it as a threat. So that to me makes it kind of a major league. And then from a historical statistical standpoint, in 1910, Al Spink wrote The National Game, and that's one of the first books that covers kind of the history of it. And he is a St. Louis sports writer, and he later claimed to have worked for like Henry Lucas on the St. Louis Union, so he might have a bias, but he wrote a lot about the Union Association in that book, and sort of treated it with equivalency to the other leagues. And then Ernest Lanigan, who was a disciple of Spink, he wrote the first baseball encyclopedia. He also, in the Baseball Encyclopedia in 1922, he also gives the Union Association sort of status as a major league. Like he includes the statistical seasons along with other like with every city he writes about each team, and then he includes the Union Association as one of those teams. So from that basis, like those two sort of treated as major league. And then in 1969, when you have the Macmillan, they officially recognize all the leagues for the Macmillan Encyclopedia. Like that's heavily influenced by the work of like Spink and Lanigan, and so undoubtedly that's part of why Union Association ends up there. And then, so if you have this thing that's been treated as a major league since like 1910, or like the history of baseball statistical analysis, it does make sense to like just it's not a major league anymore. Like to me, that would just be like a strange choice. What is needed is like context, and I'm thankful too that like with the recognition of all the Negro leagues as major leagues, then you don't have to have this debate about like, like, oh, the Union Association is a major league, but these are like, I think it's great that they're recognized too, because then you don't have to have this like, if this, then that kind of conversation. I'd much rather have that. Like it's great, and we just need context to understand what was going on when these leagues formed and stuff. But from the Bill James essay in the Baseball Abstract is a great essay, but it's like, that's not the point of why it's a major league or not. It's not simply about strict statistical quality, you know.
Sure. I think one of the arguments, I don't remember if it was in the Bill James article or whether it was elsewhere, but that people at the sports writers at the time did not, outside of St. Louis, didn't regard it as a major league. But you pointed out something when you were talking about the Cincinnati sports writer, that just, the argument could be made that the St. Louis writers, Spank and Lanigan, had bias in their favor, but you could also argue that you sort of do argue that the sports writers in other cities had a bias against them because they were probably.
Yeah. So one of the funny things that happens is most cities at that point have multiple newspapers, and so essentially in like St. Louis, there's a few papers that are very pro-union. There's a couple that are like agnostic, but because Henry Lucas is a very kind of respected figure in St. Louis, they give him a bit more slack. In Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Inquirer they're part owners of the Union Association franchise, and they give very positive coverage, but they have a great baseball section, like probably the best baseball coverage in the country in 1884. So they're pretty balanced between the two leagues, but they give a lot of good coverage to the Union Association. But the Cincinnati commercial is like, they're terrible. Like you'll see attendance reports will be like, the Inquirer says, oh, there's like 1,400 fans to the game, and then the commercial is like, no, there's 312. We were there and we counted it, and it's like, it's funny. But each city has like these multiple papers going on, and some are pro-union, some are not. But there wasn't this, like in Chicago's the only one where just no one cared. Like in the Chicago, I think the Daily Inter-Ocean and the Tribune, they both like the Union Association listed under minor games, like they're not even given any sort of like status at all. But yeah, it depends on the city, but usually there's pro and con, and even like the Sporting Life had pretty like balanced coverage of it. Like it wasn't like immediately thought of as like this is like strictly minor league. There's like, yes, there's some positive, some negative coverage.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions for Justin? I will stop the recording at that point and I'll say thank you again for this presentation, and the recording will be available on the SABR website, and I'll make sure that folks who either couldn't attend today or got thrown by the technical difficulties at the end will have a chance to see it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for everything. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. So,
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.